Voting is something that literally everyone, every citizen can get involved in, and that is something that impacts us the most on our daily lives.
The federal Constitution says almost nothing about voting or the right to vote. What the framers did was, in effect, to leave it to the states.
I think the courts have had a really important role in the evolution of voting rights in our country.
There were tens of millions of Americans who cared deeply about the environment, but they weren't voting.
I'm proud of being a veteran, but I'm prouder of knowing that I've never missed a vote, and that's the most important thing we can do.
I just registered to vote for the first time, and I'm super excited, and I'm glad I did it. We are the future. We are the generation now that's going to make the biggest difference in the world. So you just want to have your voice heard now instead of 20 years from now.
What voting rights at its core is about who gets a seat at the table.
Voting is a civic necessity. It's a community necessity. It's what gives the people power.
I happen to believe that the right to vote is precious. It's almost sacred. In the 1800s, people would often have to fight their way to the polls to cast their ballot.
After the post-Civil War period, you see African Americans voting in very large numbers.
League of Women Voters has been around for 100 years. We started out earning the right for women to vote.
We don't have one electoral system in this country. We have 51 electoral systems in this country.
A lot of people vote because they want to see change.
From the time I got out of prison to the time I got my voting rights was approximately 15 years.
Voting is probably the greatest identifier of citizenship.
If young people don't vote, politicians will never cater to the issues young people care about.
So all my young colleagues and friends nationwide, y'all need to vote. It's incredibly important that we show up.
At every level of voting, you are answering the question, who decides? And in democracy, the idea is we the people decide.
The federal Constitution says almost nothing about voting or the right to vote. There's only one office in the U.S. Constitution for which popular elections are mandated, and that's for members of the House of Representatives. And what the framers did was to leave it to the states until there are a series of interventions by the federal government in the form of constitutional amendments.
Understand the dilemma that the Founding Fathers were in. The reason they didn't come up with a uniform system of qualifications, the reason they didn't even put in a right to vote in the Constitution, was because it was just simply impractical, given the diversity of the states at the time.
All of the states, when they were colonies, already had voter eligibility laws. They had suffrage requirements of one sort or another. And they varied very substantially from one state to the other.
And no state wanted to give up their way of voting. I mean, it's like, best way to vote is Virginia's way. No, Rhode Island has the best way to vote. No, we understand, it's New York. It's New York who votes best, so we'll do it New York's way.
The reason we didn't federalize any aspect of the political process other than the formalities of we have a Congress and what the elections are and things of that sort is the slave question. The fear was that a strong federal government would, either through legislation or perhaps then it was much more remote, through judicial decree, somehow intercede in the internal life of the states. And so the compromise that was created, and it really was a compromise, was the 3/5 compromise, which recognized the number that would be associated with the slaves, but gave no rights of the franchise to anybody. So this is a major constitutional void. It's something that looks odd compared to all modern constitutions, but like all constitutions, it reflects the political realities of the time in which it was enacted.
What they were fearful of, if they adopted any one standard, was that there would be some state or states that did not ratify the Constitution because they objected to the voting qualifications. So a quite momentous decision was made early on, which was to separate citizenship, which remained the province of the federal government, from voting and voting rights, which were left to the state. And that decision was made, again, not because of any high theory, but because of the pragmatic politics of constitutional ratification in the late 1780s.
So we don't have one electoral system in this country. We have 51 electoral systems in this country. And every one of them is just a little bit different.
When the nation is first formed, I mean, even during the Revolutionary period, but even after the Constitution is written and the state constitutions are written, in most places, the people who were permitted to vote were white, not exclusively, but in most states, white, male property owners. The kind of property they could own in some states was in the form of land, or what's called real property. Some places there were sort of dollar equivalents that were specified. But you did have to own property just about everywhere in order to vote. One notable exception to this pattern is that in New Jersey, for a brief period, both African Americans and women were allowed to vote. But New Jersey shut down the voting of people besides white males early in the 19th century.
Drawing on English traditions, the belief was that to vote, you had to have a stake in society.
That if you owned property, you had an interest in good government and in the outcomes of policies that you did not have if you did not own property. That was the argument. But there were two other arguments that ran alongside it and that partially contradicted each other. One was a fear that men who did not own property could be organized and manipulated by demagogues of one sort or another. The other fear, which is very present and it slips out in the articulation, runs in the opposite direction, which is a fear that if the propertyless could vote, they might vote to take away the advantages of people who own property.
That was the fear in the Constitutional Convention, that if the poor ever mobilized around their interests, they would expropriate the rich.
What they were worried about were people whose vote could be bought. Bought by necessity, bought by need of a job, bought by food, bought because of the dominance of a husband or a father. And so these were the reasons why women and the propertyless and those who were in trades, in other words, working people, that they were denied the vote.
So there's a clear class dimension to this and class apprehensions. And indeed, class apprehensions, concerns about poor people voting and the poorest of people voting run throughout U.S. history and shape the voting laws in the United States from the 1780s to the present.
But even at the beginning, the ideals of the revolution began to challenge this idea that only property-owning white men could vote. In Pennsylvania, where they had a real revolution, Ben Franklin was in charge of writing the new Constitution, and it expanded the right to vote to men without property for the first time. It was the most radical constitution in the world.
Franklin, who is the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention, and probably the most progressive. And he, in a number of ways, not just at the convention, but in dealing with the Pennsylvania state government and elsewhere, had been for a very expansive right to vote, and he was opposed to property requirements. And he told the story, and he told the story clearly more than once. Suppose a man wants to meet a property requirement and is allowed to use the value of his farm animals to meet that property requirement. Farm animals were very valuable at the time. They were a key form of capital. So he goes to vote and he brings his jackass with him as proof that he owns the property requisite to vote. And he does vote. And then 2 years later, there's another round of elections. And he goes to vote, but he's not allowed to vote because the jackass has died and he no longer can meet the property requirement. And then Franklin ends the story by saying, so in whom is the right to vote vested? In the man or in the jackass?
The Pennsylvania government hired, as its basically chief propagandist, Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine had come to the United States after a failed career as a rope maker and corset maker in England. Within a year, he'd written common sense, which said not only let's have independence, but let's break with monarchy. It was really not a common sense idea, it was a radical idea. And Thomas Paine began to argue too for expanding the suffrage. People understood the connection between the ideals of common sense, of the Declaration of Independence, and the idea that you needed to kind of begin to move towards a democracy. Up in Massachusetts, John Adams reflected a different view. He wrote Massachusetts' Constitution, and he was urged, hey, why don't you do the same thing that they did in Pennsylvania? Why don't you end that property requirement? And John Adams was aghast. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote. Men who hath not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, he said, and they will demand the right to vote. He added, there will be no end of it.
Well, the franchise has always been limited in all of human history. It's limited today. We don't let children vote. We don't let immigrants vote. I think the most distinctive thing about the United States was that right from the beginning, the franchise was broader here than it had ever been before. It's easy to look back and say, well, you know, they had property requirements. It was only white males in most places, but you have to avoid being acontextual.
We don't want everyone to vote. We've never wanted everyone to vote. That's not the point of American democracy. What we want are the right people to vote. We want the right thinking people to vote, who understand American society and not simply sell their vote to the highest bidder. And the question is, well, how do you exclude the ones that you fear are a threat to that? Well, one way you do it is you continue to exclude people you deem dependent. That means women, that means children, that means African Americans, that means Native Americans. But the other way is you begin to limit who can vote as a white male by requiring citizenship. And so you've come over from abroad, and we're saying, you know, it's going to be 5-6 years before you're a citizen, before we can trust you with the power that is the vote. So at the same time that we're expanding the range of who can vote, we're also looking for ways to narrow it to exclude those we are worried about, who we don't really want to vote. And that's been part of history ever since.
So it turns out, and this surprised me when we found it out, environmentalists aren't very good voters. There are tens of millions of already registered to vote environmentalists who never ever show up on election day. We've come to realize that the best way to turn a non-voter into a voter, you just need to revert back to middle school and use peer pressure and social pressure. Regardless of demographics, peer pressure works. You might be 85 years old, but you still think like an 18-year-old. You can still succumb to peer pressure. We at the Environmental Voter Project never even talk about the environment. And I want to be clear, we know that all of our targets already care about environmental issues, but every time we try to convince them to vote by talking about the importance of voting because of the issues they care about, it doesn't work at all. If instead, we use peer pressure and take advantage of the fact that they want to be known as good voters, we see a dramatic impact. And I'll give you some examples. We will send letters to people or call them up on the phone who we know from their public voter files are not good voters. And we'll say, did you know that last time there was a city council election, 93 people on your block of Main Street voted? That sends turnout through the roof. We'll also send them copies of their personal voting records. We'll remind them that who they vote for is private, but whether they vote or not is public information. And when you send people a report card that reveals their personal voting history, they want to do better. They want to adhere to that societal norm. They want people to think that they're good voters. We've been able to increase turnout 4.5% over our control group. Now, if you don't think 4.5% is a big deal in this business, talk to Al Gore, talk to Hillary Clinton. 4.5% is everything in this business. Those are really, really big numbers. And we've identified almost 16 million super environmentalists who sat out the last midterm elections in the United States. So 4.5% of 16 million, I mean, that can change everything.
The Electoral College distorts the way we select our president. You know, what we have is a situation where some states' votes are weighted more heavily, some states with large populations are weighted less heavily, and I think what we really want to have is a situation where the popular vote, the vote of the people, decides the election, and not through some intermediating mechanism that maybe worked 200 years ago, but I don't think it works now.
Originally, presidential elections were conducted where the person who got the most electoral votes became president, and the person who got the second most electoral votes became vice president. So the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson was running for president against John Adams. He won against Adams, but he didn't win against his potential vice president, Aaron Burr. They actually tied in the number of electors.
Burr did not gracefully step aside for Jefferson, tried to basically win the presidency. It went to much voting and debate in the House of Representatives. As fans of the musical Hamilton know, only when the Federalists and Alexander Hamilton threw their support to Jefferson did Jefferson win.
And what this did was that it precipitated the need for a 12th Amendment where the electors have to specify who they want for vice president and who they want for president in order to ensure what happened in 1800 wouldn't happen again.
In that election in which Jefferson defeated Adams, first time that an incumbent had ever been voted out of office in human history.
What happens in 1824 is there are 4 people running for office. Andrew Jackson gets the most votes, both electorally and in the popular vote. But he doesn't get a majority in the Electoral College. So it's thrown to the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote.
Henry Clay was also running for president, and he cut a deal with John Quincy Adams to have the delegations that he kind of had control over throw their support behind John Quincy Adams.
And Henry Clay becomes Adams's Secretary of State. Jackson cries a dirty deed in a smoke-filled room.
Andrew Jackson famously called this a corrupt bargain.
I always hear in the back of my mind an Austrian voice saying, "I'll be back," because that's exactly what he threatened.
In 1828, he was able to come back and defeat John Quincy Adams.
The thing to understand about the Electoral College, it was created because of a technical problem that the founders faced. How do you pick a president across a 1,000-mile nation, 300-400 miles inland, with individual states so different from each other?
Part of the justification for the Electoral College is that it was a compromise between the big states and the small states. The small states felt that they would never be able to compete if the president was elected through popular vote.
The Electoral College was an idea that was cooked up at the Constitutional Convention out of great difficulty. The delegates to the convention acknowledged that they had a lot of trouble figuring out what should be done to choose a chief executive. The most widespread idea that they had, and that kept coming up again and again, was that Congress should choose the president. And everybody seemed to walk away scratching their heads, saying, you know, that's really not such a good idea because then you don't have separation of powers. and then it's going to be corrupt. And so it's really not a good thing, but they kept coming back to it. They didn't have any better idea. Get to the end of the summer. They've been there for 4 months already. They're tired. And in effect, they declare a vacation for the Constitutional Convention of 1 week, but they leave in place a committee of 1 representative from each state, and it's called the Committee on Unfinished Parts. And the Committee on Unfinished Parts is the group that comes up with the idea for the Electoral College. The belief about how it would operate was that the people would choose electors, and the electors would use their own judgments and deliberate and choose among candidates.
The assumption was that you might know who the politicians were in your state, but across the nation? So I'm going to vote for you, the elector, because I trust you. I think you're a knowledgeable person, and I believe you know enough about the nation as a whole that you can make a good choice. Then you would come and you would vote on the Electoral College Day, and those votes would be counted.
Within 10 years after the institution was created, the electors in general were not deliberating, they were not using their own judgments, they were just messengers from the states. It's also winner take all, which is the way we experience it now within a state, was never part of the Constitution, and that evolved only gradually over the first 30 or 40 years of the history of the country. It was widely believed by the Founding Fathers, including by James Madison, that the way electoral votes should be allocated by a state was by districts, a little bit like representation in Congress, so that winner take all was not what they had in mind.
The main problem that it has is that it distorts our politics to be concerned only with the states that are in play. And so basically, it's Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and pretty much you run an election that way.
Twice in the last 2 decades, the person who lost the popular vote became president anyway because they won the electoral vote. That's the 4th time in American history.
There's a lot of good and a lot of bad that comes with the Electoral College. One nice thing about the Electoral College is that you do end up paying attention to those states that are within the margins. And I don't think anyone is really prepared or can say with any certainty how campaigns change once you're dealing with a national popular vote. Where the Electoral College is least reflective on the will of the people is not when one state flips because of 14,000 voters and it tilts the election outcome, but when you have a state like New York or California or Texas that is just inherently underrepresented because we haven't expanded the size of Congress in 100 years.
The big affront to the one person, one vote ideal is the Senate. And so by comparison to the Senate, the distortion created by the Electoral College is quite minimal because the representation of each state is based on its congressional delegation, which is all based on one person, one vote, plus 2 additional votes for the Senate.
I do think that a constitutional amendment that abolished the Electoral College would be something that would make a lot of sense. Obviously very difficult to win under the current circumstances, but I think something that should be considered.
The Electoral College has been the subject of more attempts at constitutional amendment than any other subject in the U.S. history. It starts before 1800. In the first 30 years of the 19th century, the Senate votes, I think, 5 times, approves a constitutional amendment that would have electors chosen by district, but there were tensions between the small and large states that were very considerable and that made cutting a deal difficult in the House. The sad truth about the period from after the Civil War into the 1960s and 1970s is that race plays a very strong role in it. The South does not want to switch to a national popular vote ever, and this is even true in the early 19th century. Before the Civil War, obviously African Americans could not vote, they were slaves. But Southern states were given representation for 3/5 of their slaves, the infamous 3/5 clause.
The 3/5 clause meant that slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation. The Electoral College is allocated based on a state's congressional representation, their representation in the House of Representatives plus their 2 senators. Because slave states are overrepresented in the House because slaves count as 3/5 of a person, then the Electoral College gave a bonus to the slave states.
If they had switched to a national popular vote, the South would have lost tremendous political clout because it would have lost the power that came from the 3/5 clause. They were adamantly opposed to any such system. Move ahead to 1890, 1900, 1910, and then into the 20th century. And the South at that point is effectively benefiting from a 5/5 clause. They're getting representation for all African Americans in Congress and in electoral votes, but they're still not voting. And so they oppose any shift to a national popular vote absolutely adamantly. They think it will really threaten the Southern way of life and segregation. They would have lost a lot of clout in presidential elections because many fewer people were voting, or they would have had to enfranchise African Americans, in 1910 or 1920, and they did not want to do that. We came very, very close to getting rid of the Electoral College in 1970. This is something that nobody knows. A constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College and have a national popular vote was passed by a vote about 83% in the House, and it had a large majority in the Senate. It had a reasonable chance of getting ratified by the states, but it was killed by a filibuster led by largely Southern senators in 1970.
There's another effort that I've been a part of, which is to challenge not the Electoral College as such, but the winner-take-all feature for the Electoral College delegation that's used in every state except for Nebraska and Maine. And if you think about the winner-take-all feature, which means in New York, if the Democrat gets 58% of the presidential vote, the Democratic candidate gets 100% of the electors. And in Texas, if the Republican gets 60% of the vote, they get 100% of the electors. And this is the first time that there's a serious effort. There are 4 lawsuits underway right now on this issue.
There's an effort afoot right now called the National Popular Vote Compact, where states are agreeing that as soon as enough states that represent 270 electoral votes agree that they will vote all of their electoral votes for whichever nominee receives the majority of the popular vote, regardless of whether or not that particular nominee won that specific state.
I have problems with that as being disempowering to the choice of the people of the state. Here we voted, we've made our choice, but you're going to give our electoral votes to somebody else because what other states did?
It'll be fought over in courts for years if it actually passed.
What's more important today is expanding the access to the vote and less about how those votes are counted in the Electoral College.
It is so important to vote because your voice does count. Your one single vote is so important. So when I go out to vote, I'm going to bring 10 of my friends with me.
We have learned the hard way that when you don't give importance to your voice and making your voice heard in your government, neither do your representatives.
We have to be the change. We can't just sit back idly by and let these lawmakers keep imposing their invisible hands and then complain when we're unhappy with the results. If we want change, we have to make it.
A person who influenced me significantly is my father. He's had such an impact on what I think and how I feel about things like voting, and telling me the importance and how lucky we are to live in a country that is a democracy and to live in a place that we are lucky enough to vote, and the people who are in power are the people that we decided should be in power.
For much of American history, voting was in public. It was an often drunken, sometimes riotous affair. In the colonial days, it was expected that candidates would provide booze for voters. And if they didn't, it was considered a very bad slap in the face to the public.
They weren't trying to bribe the voters, far from that. No, what they're trying to show is that I'm a good guy. You know, the old saying, would you want to have a beer with that politician? Well, this was their way of proving that. And Washington was very good at this because Washington was actually a distiller. He specialized in distilling rye whiskey. At one point, he was the largest producer of rye whiskey in North America. And so he would bring a cask or two of his whiskey, he'd bring some ham and food from Mount Vernon, and everyone would be in a partying mood, and then one by one you would walk up and you would declare who you were backing.
You would go with your friends, you would go with your neighbors, and you would call out your vote. It was very much a tribal activity.
By this point, all you need to vote is to be a white male over 21 who can pay a relatively insignificant poll tax. And in some places, you don't even have to pay the poll tax. Well, how are we going to organize you to get you to come vote? So what would happen is the parties would put together rallies, big barbecues in which they would serve lots of meat and lots of drink. But there was a little bit more now of buying votes with who gave me the better barbecue, who gave me the better alcohol.
Votes have always been sold. The way that you enlist lower classes in having a stake and an incentive structure to rise above immediate needs is something that's been part of the democratic experiment right from the beginning.
I think the classic image that we have is that it's the urban bosses who are engaging in this corruption. But in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that actually there's a lot of rural county vote buying in different places that's less visible to us, but was in fact as or more prevalent.
Young people used to play a much larger role than they do today. There's this period from 1830s to 1900 where politics was really at the center of American life. It's the main cultural thing that people do together. One of the things young people care about a lot back then is meeting a spouse or courting. When there are big public events at midnight in your town, it's a good environment for young men and women to come out and flirt and meet each other. It's seen as appropriate to be out there, and young women can talk to strange men in the street in a way they couldn't do otherwise because they're doing it to help the system of government. And so for those men who can vote, they really gravitate to politics as almost their introduction to adulthood. They call it their virgin vote. And when you cast your first vote, you lose your political virginity and you prove yourself a man in the eyes of society. You grow a beard or a mustache or something and prove that you're a masculine man and not a beardless boy, and you vote for a party, and you often, after you cast your virgin vote, have partisan monogamy for the rest of your life. Something like 95% of voters vote the same in election after election across this era. People don't often switch parties, and those people who do are really looked down upon, honestly, as effeminate and lacking in backbone and kind of weak-willed. Women who can't vote still try to influence the men in their lives, their boyfriends, their brothers, their fathers, to vote the way they want them to. They turn down marriage proposals from people who support the wrong party. We see a lot of young women who are abolitionists around the Civil War era who say, "I'm not going to marry you, you support slavery." What makes this era so exciting is that voter turnout for eligible voters is often in the high 70s and gets up over 80%. And some states that are particularly engaged in politics have turnout over 90% in 5 or 6 presidential elections in a row. But that high turnout was driven by these 21-year-olds who are so excited to go vote. So young people's engagement is also really shaped by how voting worked at the time. It didn't used to be that you go into a booth and mark your choice on a government ballot. Basically, people cast their own ballots that were manufactured by the political parties. You go into the town square, the local church, and there's a box with a hole in it, and you put your ballot in the box and it marks your vote.
In the 1800s, people would often have to fight their way to the polls to cast their ballot. People from the other party would try to block them.
Challengers would stand around the ballot box and try to make sure people could legally vote. And they'd do this based on whether they recognized the person, how old the person was. But they were also trying to judge whether they thought they were going to vote for their party or not. They might try to intimidate, threaten, or hit the person with a brick. There's a lot of political violence back then. There's not an election in this period that is clean and peaceful.
Sometimes polling places were in the back room of a saloon.
Voting was raucous. One of the traditional forms of public demonstration in a campaign was the torchlight march through the city, with hundreds of men carrying torches and chanting slogans of various sorts. One of the arguments that was used for saying let's not have women vote was that this was too ungenteel, potentially threatening.
The Wide Awakes are young men who support Abe Lincoln in 1860, which is the election that brings about the Civil War. Basically, they're young men living throughout the North who feel that the North has been trampled on by the South and by what they call the slave power. And so they want to kind of assert young Northern masculinity. And so what they do is they get these pseudo-military uniforms, these cloaks and these capes that are shiny and black, and they get torches, and they have these marches of tens of thousands of people marching through towns throughout America. They really rile people up. One of the distinctions is that instead of being kind of a drunken mob, they basically follow some kind of military martial order. So they march in silence, and they beat drums, and they march in step, and they really excite young Northerners, and they really scare Southerners who see that up in New York or up in Wisconsin, it looks like there's a paramilitary force organizing. It just shows how what is really done to win an election and get some 22-year-olds fired up helps bring about the Civil War, and how political behavior can really amp up national tensions. So from the 1840s to 1900, young people just keep being brought in, new voters keep turning out and driving this high turnout. Something happens around 1900 and voter turnout, especially youth voter turnout, plummets. Reformers who don't like this ugly system try to clean up politics. They stop holding these big rallies, and they don't want to buy fireworks, and they don't light torches. They want to read speeches and give out educational literature. It's not very appealing anymore. You can go to the movies, you can watch vaudeville. There are all these things that are great entertainment that are a lot more fun than this increasingly dry political system. So it just doesn't have the same attractive power that it used to. So what I'll say is the idea that young people don't vote is a historical artifact of a time, of the 20th century. And we saw pretty poor involvement of young people throughout the 20th century. And it actually seems to get worse over the century. But young people today have really shown a great engagement in politics, and the numbers have been up consistently. This most recent midterm election had a 10% jump for young voters from the 2014 midterm election. We really are seeing more engagement, and I don't want to say we're out of the woods and that young people will be perfectly involved. We might struggle for a while, but there is this narrative of a dip of youth involvement, and we seem to be maybe coming out of that.
Headcount is a national, non-partisan nonprofit that essentially uses the power of music to engage Americans, primarily young Americans, with our democracy. What we're most famous for is going to concerts and music festivals around the country and registering young people to vote. Right now, Headcount has about 125 deputized team leaders in over 60 cities across the country. We're a volunteer-driven organization. Our volunteers decide a lot of the shows that we go to. They have partnerships with venues. They're the backbone of Headcount. We do comedy events, we do comedy shows, we do pride events, we've done certain marches. Really anywhere that our volunteers want to be at, assuming it's nonpartisan, we'll be at. We'll never support a candidate, we'll never support a party, but we'll support people who want to make their voices heard.
Well, a lot of young people rarely have the opportunity to be involved civically or in making change in their government. And once they can start voting at the age of 18 and see, especially in the local elections, that they are having an impact, then they will be voters for life.
We are totally reaching out to Gen Zers. They are by far the most receptive group I personally have ever had to interact with when doing voter registration. It's so nice to see people that are excited to register to vote. On top of registering people to vote, we also try to encourage people to turn out to vote by registering them for turbo votes. It is an election alert service that either gives them a text message or an email about 30 days in advance before a local election, so this is primaries included, as well as the day before. So this quick reminder where their polling booths are, if they need to maybe bring something different, if their voting laws in their states have changed. Obviously, registering to vote is the first step, but critical thinking is the second. There is definitely an important part about actually taking the time to research, to really figure out and decide for yourself who is the right person to vote for. Over the years, we have seen that negative reasons don't get people out of bed, it's positive reasons.
People are more likely to get engaged if it looks fun. And if we can sell our democracy as a fun cultural event, people will get involved.
The phrase gerrymandering comes from Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts. He signed into law a district that was so misshapen that the political cartoonist of the time said it looked like a salamander, and he called it a gerrymander. And that's where we get the name from. The very first gerrymandered district, even before they invented the word, was when James Madison ran for Congress in the first election, and Patrick Henry drew the district to try to keep him from winning. So we've had gerrymandering from the very beginning, but it has gotten worse because of computers. It used to be an art, and now it's a science.
In the last 30, 40 years, we have two different incarnations of gerrymandering. One is racial gerrymanders, or district lines drawn to exclude or discriminate against minorities, or to make it more difficult for minorities to wield the appropriate amount of political power. There's a legal issue which has been around for a long time, which is that is it okay to draw lines taking race into effect so that, for example, you guarantee a certain number of districts that will have African American majorities. The second form of gerrymandering has to do with partisan gerrymandering, with parties gerrymandering, drawing district lines to advantage themselves.
Since 2010, we've had mean-spirited partisan gerrymandering, which has distorted the representation at state legislatures and in Congress, and I think discourages people from voting because the politicians are picking their voters rather than the voters picking the politicians.
The Supreme Court weighed in on whether or not states should be able to gerrymander, and more importantly, whether or not the court should be able to police the issue of gerrymandering. So where districts are gerrymandered for racial reasons, right, the court still sort of polices racial gerrymandering. But where it's for partisan reasons, the court will not hear those claims. So instead of relying on the federal Supreme Court, litigants now need to turn more to state constitutions to try to attack these claims. That has been successful in Pennsylvania in a very big case. And Florida has a constitutional amendment which bars any consideration of partisanship in drawing districts.
One very hopeful solution to the problem of gerrymandering is the creation of an independent citizen redistricting commission. The two most well-known states that have that are California and Arizona, that in a very much nonpartisan way and in a citizen engagement kind of way have drawn districts that by all accounts have been far, far better than what the legislatures produced before them.
So there are options, but for the Supreme Court to abdicate its duty when it has this history, this 50-year history of policing the political realm is very disappointing.
I just want to be able to vote for people who I think are going to best represent the interests of my community and the well-being of my community.
I want to get out to vote, but I also want to be educated when I vote. Then you're going to have more of a chance of voting someone into office that's going to reflect your views.
I really wasn't considering voting, but now that I see all my friends getting involved, I think it's time for me to make this change. I'm Charlie, and I'm 18 years old, and I registered to vote.
I was taking a class about voter registration forms, and they basically told us what to do, what not to do, how to read the form, what you should suggest, and basically what to do in order not to get fined. I know that right now I can't vote or I can't pre-register, but I want to encourage people who are older than me because I have a lot of friends that are sophomores and juniors and seniors, and I want to encourage them that voting is the right thing to do and that your voice will be heard. I'm Janice and I'm 14 years old.
Women couldn't vote, not because they weren't citizens, it was because they were deemed to be inherently dependent. Dependent on a father, dependent on a husband. But what say you live in Nantucket and your husband makes his living sailing on the whaling ships? He's gone for 3 years. Somebody's got to run the family business, maintain the home, enter into contracts, deal with the estate. So here you have a woman who's doing effectively what was deemed a man's job, who does not have a male superior to her who's local, who's around, who has the necessary property. And so in many cases, they allowed the woman to vote for the family. And then let's say your husband who's off on a whaling ship, the ship sinks. You inherit the family property. You've got enough property to vote. You're running a family business. Well, where's the dependency? And so in those situations, usually involving widowed women, or women who never married, but the males in her family had died out, if they had the property, they could vote. It was a small number, and what happens about the late 1820s is states begin to hold a series of state constitutional conventions, and they begin to fiddle with the rules about who can vote. And one of the things that they do is they make it explicit that in those situations women could not vote.
The women's suffrage movement got its start in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The movement was primarily headed by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The movement really grew out of the abolitionist movement. And so because of that, they aligned themselves with people like Frederick Douglass in order to both fight for not only women's rights, but the rights of African Americans.
The ability of women to gain the franchise is an extraordinary political story at many, many levels, because it means that men voted to dilute their votes by allowing an equal or slightly greater number of women to vote as well. The women's movement was a major political mobilization, but it was a mobilization of respectable middle-class women.
My great-great-grandmother was a pioneer in the suffrage movement, and she was one of the early ones in 1848, starting in Seneca Falls. And she was part of the co-convener of the first Women's Rights Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton grew up in the early 1800s, and in her town in upstate New York, she grew up with law all around her.
Her father was an attorney, and she would listen at his door of his office. He would have clients coming to visit. And she would listen and was becoming extremely concerned about how the laws were affecting women in particular, because they didn't have rights. One of the stories was she was given a necklace, a coral necklace from her father, who she adored. But she was told, when you get married, you will no longer own that necklace. It will belong to your husband. And if he wishes to sell that necklace, he has every right to do so. He could even sell it for tobacco and smoke it up. She was outraged that she didn't have the right to her property.
So she understood the importance of law and rights. And one of the things that she always heard every single year at July 4th is the reading of the Declaration of Independence. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and this small handful of women said, hey, those are great ideas. They have to also be applied to women. For instance, they couldn't own property in their own name. When they were married, if they had a job, they couldn't own their own wages. They couldn't vote for the people that were representing them. So she saw an enormous amount of unfairness. But in order to change society, you had to vote and make sure that the people who represented you represented your vision of what a good society is.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, on her honeymoon, part of it was to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. That was 1840. And when she was there, she met others, Lucretia Mott in particular, who's from Nantucket, Massachusetts, and they built a tremendous friendship. And Lucretia Mott was someone who had a great passion about equality, as a Quaker in particular. And I think that Elizabeth Cady Stanton found a soulmate, certainly in terms of someone who understood the challenges that women face and their lack of rights. So they go to this convention, and there was a vote taken, and it turns out that women were not allowed to vote or given full equal rights at the convention. In fact, needed to sit. They were seated separately. And William Lloyd Garrison was a great abolitionist, and he was there, and he was so outraged by this ruling that he decided he would forfeit his vote and join them. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with all of her wonderful schooling, drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, that's what she called it, based on the Declaration of Independence. Included in this were basic rights for property and so forth for women. But at the end of this list, she included and insisted on including that women get the right to vote.
Lucretia Mott, a very dignified woman, said to ask for the vote is too controversial.
But Frederick Douglass who was a part of this group, agreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and helped convince people that giving women the right to vote was critical. So it was included, it was voted on, and the Declaration of Sentiments drafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton was adopted.
This convention that they had in 1848 in Seneca Falls, it was the first among many.
In 1850, it became what was then called the National Women's Rights Convention, and the first one was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. At this time, women were not accustomed to speaking in public, nor were they encouraged to do so. They were discouraged from doing so. It wasn't considered ladylike to speak in public, so women didn't have the skills. They were nervous about it, and it was hard for them to do. Abby Kelly Foster, who is a wonderful advocate, was one of the convention speakers, and she was excellent. And she had gone to Oberlin College, where there was a young student named Lucy Stone from Massachusetts. And Lucy heard her and became very enraptured by this, and that was the beginning of Lucy Stone becoming a big advocate for women's rights. Lucy Stone, when she married, she kept her name, and people who did that were then called stoners. The interesting thing about the bloomers is that when the suffragists began wearing them, they were ridiculed, they were made fun of, they were talked about in terms of their clothing and how ridiculous these outfits were. Susan B. Anthony, for instance, wore bloomers when she gave speeches, and it became such a distraction she gave it up and decided she couldn't compete with that. So back to Amelia Bloomer, she introduced Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and she introduced them in Seneca Falls.
They formed a bond that lasted 50 years, and they were very different from each other, and yet they could work together. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's a mother. She has 7 children. Susan B. Anthony decides not to get married and had obviously a lot more mobility. And so Susan B. Anthony would come over to Stanton's house and said, "You go write a speech. I'll mind the children and I'll stir the pudding." And Susan would go out in the nation delivering the speech, but also bring back a lot of facts and ideas.
It wasn't until the 14th and 15th Amendments and debates around African American suffrage in particular that you start to see fissures in the movement, in part because of the insertion of the word male in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. So Section 2 of the 14th Amendment allows Congress to reduce a state's delegation in the House of Representatives if the state abridges the right to vote, but abridges the right to vote of males who are 21 years or older and citizens. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in particular objected to that language. Frederick Douglass felt that everyone should sort of coalesce behind African American male suffrage right now, and then we would come back to women. But of course their position was, well, when is it our turn? The 15th Amendment prohibited discrimination in voting on the basis of race.
The key element there is that the states precluded women from voting, and that was acceptable.
So the focus on African American men to the exclusion of white women and African American women really was a breaking point for the women's suffrage movement relative to the fight for civil rights for African Americans. One of the biggest problems is that you see members of the women's suffrage movement start to use very racialized language in objecting to the 15th Amendment in particular. One thing that they wanted to do was contrast the votes of wealthy, educated white women as a means of offsetting the votes of African American men who are less educated and they just emerged from slavery. And so they tried to sort of make the case for white women's suffrage in particular by using racialized language that caused even broader separation in the movement between Douglass and advocates like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the great figures in American history, said, "Do we really want to give the vote to the lower orders of Irish, African, and Chinese people?"
What women were saying is, look, you're giving votes to these immigrants who are not American, and here we are, women born in America, raised in America, generations in America. Shouldn't we have the vote to counteract their un-Americanness when it came to the vote?
In the late 19th century, the women's suffrage movement makes a turn for about 15 years towards embracing what was called educated suffrage. And in effect, they were calling for literacy tests. And the part of the argument that they were making was that if you had literacy tests, if you had educated suffrage, including for women, that you would greatly increase, in effect, the number of middle class and upper middle class voters proportionally, because you would add middle class white women and be subtracting out working class and black men who were not literate.
They also aligned themselves with the temperance movement, which was heavily anti-immigrant, and they feared all these swarthy Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans who were coming into America and who liked to drink beer and wine.
The amount that people drank back in the late 1800s created tremendous problems because there were men who would drink after work and became alcoholics. So it was considered a social ill that was really harming women, because we know when women didn't have the right to property, it also meant they didn't have the right to their own money. Even if they were working, their earnings were turned over to their husbands. So the temperance movement to prohibit alcohol was gaining, and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other suffragists joined with this effort. So together they worked for women's right to get the vote and for the Prohibition Amendment, hoping that it would improve their lives.
The women's movement also had huge tension with the labor movement, which was a major democratizing force in Reconstruction, post-Civil War United States, but which was extremely hostile to breaking down gender barriers because they represented craft union workers who had a monopoly on certain trades and were fearful of opening those up.
It was about this time that the first states to grant women the right to vote were in the West, because they wanted to attract people to come west and they needed women to go west. So they did give them more rights. They participated more in society and they used it. They knew women would be attracted to having their rights.
California was one of them. But one of the problems that women still face with respect to exercising that right to vote is that if they married a foreigner or someone who was a non-citizen, they could lose their right to vote. Marital expatriation is what it was called.
New York State is the first state east of the Mississippi that, at the time, granted women the right to vote. We've been talking about higher levels of office, president, senator, representative, state representative, but actually school boards did allow women to run.
The women's suffrage movement was effective in changing laws at the state level. But also, these women sued, right? They sued in federal court. They challenged state laws that disenfranchised women as un-Republican in form. They challenged state laws that disenfranchised women as a violation of the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. In a famous case called Minor versus Habersat, Virginia Minor, who was the plaintiff in that case, couldn't even file her petition in federal court. She had to have her husband file it for her because women weren't allowed to do that. So she had to have her husband file her petition to challenge a law that would not allow her to vote. So in Minor versus Habersat, the Supreme Court held that voting was not a privilege or immunity of citizenship, further cementing the separation between being a citizen and being a voter. And so women are citizens, right? The court affirmed that, but they did not necessarily have to be voters.
Another thing that happened often when women would be asking for the vote, both in this country and England and elsewhere, is they were considered to be crazy. And there were stories of women being institutionalized as being insane. The notion that they would have these ideas about freedom and independence and rights were so alien to people that they often were literally considered crazy.
In 1913, the day before President Wilson's inauguration, suffragettes staged a parade. And so they were able to make this really powerful statement about support for women's suffrage to the nation. And in particular, because it was done in connection with the presidential inauguration, when you really do have the eyes of the country on Washington, D.C.
Leading the parade on a white horse was a woman named Inez Milholland. She was an attorney, very unusual in those days. She could not attend Yale Law School where she wanted to go because they did not accept women. But she did go to New York University Law School and became an attorney in New York. She was a passionate advocate for women's rights and turned out to be a spectacular speaker and would attract large crowds. There was police presence, but at some point the crowd got rowdy and they started throwing things at them and tearing at their skirts and at their banners, and it broke out into a riot. And I believe there were hundreds who were hospitalized. And the next day in the newspaper, it was front page news. Interestingly, the old guard of the suffrage movement was horrified, but Alice Paul was thrilled that it was on the front page of the paper because it meant people would learn about the movement and come to know what it was taking for women to try to get the vote.
This doesn't really effectively cover the fact that there were still fissures within the women's suffrage movement. African-American women had to march at the back of the parade, which further highlighted the dilemma faced by African-American women who were dealing with maybe misogyny from African-American men who didn't think women should vote, but also the race issue from white suffragettes who didn't think African-American women were equal. Yet these women still turned out, they still marched. History often overlooks the dilemma that they faced as being African-American women in a world where race and gender was not prized.
Yet it was black women who were maids, who were in white homes, who heard white men talking about their tactics to suppress the female vote, who would then tell the suffragettes, you know, I was cooking for Miss So-and-so this morning and they're planning on doing this or that this afternoon. So black women, they were a conduit for information that helped to advance the suffragette movement, but yet had to shrink in the background so as not to provide a visible presence that would be perceived as even more of a threat by white men.
One of the issues that came out of this parade was about inclusion. There was a woman by the name of Ida B. Wells who was working very hard for civil rights, women's rights, for African American rights. She worked tirelessly against lynching. She was really passionate about doing what she could to try to stop these horrific lynchings. She also was a suffragist and asked to march in the parade with her delegation from her home state. She was told that she would have to march with the other African American women at the back of the parade. She didn't listen, and she snuck in and walked with her state in the parade and was defiant. And it was about this time as well, along with the parade, that an African-American sorority began called the Deltas, and they're still strong today. And they began in 1913 around this parade, and in 2013, they replicated the parade in Washington, D.C. for the Deltas. After the 1913 parade, Inez Milholland did attract crowds as she spoke throughout the country. Unfortunately, she also was sick and became sicker and sicker, and of course she was pushing herself terribly. So in 1916, in October, she was in Los Angeles on stage speaking, and she said, "I would ask President Wilson, how long must we wait? How long must this heartbreaking struggle for justice go on?" With those words, Inez Milholland collapsed and was taken by ambulance to the hospital, where she died about a month later. And she was only about 30 years old. And she did become a martyr and someone who symbolized the fight for women to get the vote.
You had protests and pickets in front of the White House for the first time. You had hunger strikes. So many of the creative tactics of nonviolent protest that were used by others were pioneered by the women fighting for the right to vote.
The women who were picketing the White House called themselves the Silent Sentinels.
These women stood there in all weather.
Day and night, they were out there holding signs. In the winter, they had bricks that they would heat so they could stand on heated bricks in the cold. When war broke out, it became a major debate whether the suffragists should continue to picket the White House. There were many who were offended that they would picket a sitting president, particularly during war. That's when some violence broke out against the women at the White House. And then the women were accused of disrupting the peace, even though they hadn't started it, and they were sent off to the Algonquin prison, which was a horrible, horrible institution where they were terribly mistreated, and they did have hunger strikes, which ultimately meant forced feedings. Those who survived had an event in Washington, D.C. to celebrate their return when they were released and to honor and recognize what they had done.
There was a mark put next to each candidate for office on where they stood on the women's franchise. And that turned each local election into a mini referendum on this, and candidates were fearful of being identified with hostility to the women's vote.
There was a young 24-year-old legislator, Harry Burns, who was scheduled to vote against suffrage. His mother, however, believed that women should get the vote. And she sent him a message that was delivered to him during all of this debating. And at the very end, he changed his vote and voted in favor of suffrage. They didn't hear his vote at first, they had to recount it, and it was silence for a time until the women in the gallery figured out they got it. This was it.
19th Amendment passes, right? Jubilation, absolute jubilation. But it shouldn't obscure the fact that there were still large segments of both white women and African American women who could not vote for various reasons. And the next 4 decades will be pivotal in trying to open up the franchise to those groups in a way that's meaningful.
A lot of people don't get to pick their leaders. We do. So why let that opportunity just pass you by when you could very easily just walk into your nearest voting booth and just say, I want this person to represent me. My name is Selena. I'm 19 years old and I vote.
Approximately every year, 4 million people turn 18. The young people directly have that potential and have that power to sway these elections. And I think it's important because the youth are the future, and it's important for young people to vote and to pick their leaders. My name is Jamal, I'm 20 years old, and I voted because it's my civic duty.
The best way to get someone to come out to vote is one-on-one, knocking on their doors, making that human connection, building relationships.
There are states that require 50% or more to win. Those states like Alabama require you to hold a runoff if somebody doesn't get 50% the first time through. And then there are other states where it's a plurality. Whoever gets one more vote than the other guy wins. There is a process, however, called rank choice voting. Ranked choice voting is this. You come in and you vote for your number 1 candidate. And then you say, and here's my second choice, and here's my third choice. Now, when they count votes, they only count your first choice.
Someone who has the most number ones, if they have more than 50%, well, they've won the election. It's done. They have a majority. They're a consensus choice.
But let's say nobody gets 50%. So they take the people who voted for the third person, the lowest number, and they take away those votes, and they say, who was the second choice of all those people who voted for number 3? And they add those votes to the other 2 candidates.
And that spreads up, and then you keep on doing that until you get someone who's won 50%, who has a majority. The beauty about ranked choice voting is that you don't need another runoff election. Like some states do have runoffs, but then they have them like a month later, and not many people show up in that second runoff. But what ranked choice does, it does it all in one election. So you're having runoffs within the same election. There's another name for ranked choice voting, and it's called the instant runoff. Voters love it. It's no longer zero sum. It's no longer one person against the other person. All these people running, they all have to kind of worry about that number 2 vote and the number 3 vote. They can't just go for their base voters, that one little block, and elect them. They have to kind of worry about who might be voting for the Greens or who might be voting for the Libertarians. If there's a Libertarian candidate that's better than the other 2 parties, they might even win the election, and give them a chance. It's their right to have that chance. The candidates running in a ranked choice voting system have to start being nice to each other.
When it comes to Latinos, one thing that a lot of people don't think about is this idea that there is a circle of individuals who know somebody who is undocumented or illegal in this country, and therefore they're hesitant to contact government services, like voting, in the fear that that person that they know and love will be deported. And so therefore it's going to decrease their ability to go and get out and vote.
Mi Familia Vota makes sure that we reach out to the Latino community through community organizations, through faith-based organizations, through the schools, and going and making sure that our local businesses are aware of the political decisions that are being made that can affect them. So Mi Familia Vota is interested in getting out the Latino vote by meeting them where they're at.
When I sign up people to register to vote, it's a really powerful feeling. It makes me feel like we're changing lives. So we go to marches, and I was trying to get people to register to vote. Are you guys registered to vote? I actually went into a group of kids, and they were going to be 18 before the election. So I got them all registered to vote. They were really excited.
Mi Familia Vota is creating an atmosphere and a culture of voting by allowing people to not be afraid to come out and vote and using their voice to create changes.
In the progressive era, which is roughly the first couple decades of the 20th century, it's an era of reform. And one of the things that they were pushing was to make the electoral process more democratic. They supported the idea of what's called the Australian ballot, the secret ballot.
It made it harder to bribe people because you didn't know how they were going to vote. You couldn't control them anymore. And it eliminated illiterates from voting, because you started to restrict who could go into the polls with them.
Before the Australian ballot, parties distributed votes, or candidates distributed votes to voters, and you went to somebody who was at the polls, who was from your candidate's group, and they gave you the ballot, and you put it in. But once the Australian ballot comes in, which is in effect a state-issued ballot, then the question arises, well, whose name is going to be on the ballot? And that becomes a decision that in effect is determined by rules adopted by state legislatures and city councils. And in effect what happened was that they made it much more difficult for third parties to get on the ballot.
Teddy Roosevelt was the great progressive president. And Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives understood that the answer to inequality was democracy.
They pushed the idea of the initiative, the recall, and the referendum, which about 18 states adopted at that time, which would allow for direct participatory democracy.
You get increasingly the use of primaries as a nominating device, and you get the Electoral College elected by the voters rather than appointed by the state legislatures.
So we were expanding the range of not only how we voted, but who we could vote for. And that included the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct elections of senators.
Under the original Constitution, senators were appointed by state legislatures. And the progressives believed that these state legislatures were in the pocket of business interests. And so they appointed people to these Senate seats who sort of owed their allegiance to the business community and were not concerned about the people in the state. The 17th Amendment was a reflection of that. This is why they advocated for the popular election of senators.
We're all made equal, and each one of our voices should be heard equally.
The history of suffrage among Native Americans follows its own somewhat bizarre trajectory. They are regarded as potentially worthy of electoral participation, but only if, in effect, they give up their native ways and live like a white person, then that would be fine. Some states, particularly in the West and in the Southwest, restrict the voting of Native Americans on two somewhat opportunistic and unusual grounds. One was that Native Americans who lived on reservations were not subject to taxes. Many state constitutions say among the exclusions, people cannot vote where Indians not taxed. So there the tax-paying requirement is coming back in as a way of excluding this quite large group of people. The argument never really made a whole lot of sense because a lot of Native Americans whose land on reservations was not taxed, but they were paying taxes in other ways. There were laws that also excluded people who were believed to be cognitively unable to vote. They were people, quotes, under guardianship. The classic case would have been perhaps somebody in a mental hospital would be excluded. Well, through a complicated legal argument that had to do with the nature of Indians living on reservations, that they were part of the United States but included in this under guardianship provision and excluded. Those legal exclusions are not eliminated until the 1950s.
For those legislators that are expecting a low voter turnout, you better watch out because there are students within these walls that are going to be voting.
It's simple. This is how it works. If you want things to change, you have to vote for people who will change them.
The first time I voted absentee. I had just gone to college right before that election came around. I had fun checking that box and making sure I got in there, and the candidate I wanted to win that state won that state.
In the wake of the Civil War, after the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, you had a flowering of democracy in the South.
There were federal troops at the voting polls to protect the right of black men to vote. Women did not have the right to vote at that time.
You had 90% voter participation rates among African American men. Hundreds of them elected to state legislatures, to Congress, as governor, as senator. It was a really extraordinary experiment in democracy.
The registration process in a lot of the world is automatic. Once you turn of age, whatever that may be, you're registered. In the United States, you have to do this extra step and actually go out and register to vote.
Voter registration is really something designed to suppress voting, and suppress participation is just a barrier.
I think if we had automatic voter registration, whereby when persons went to a government agency, they were registered to vote if they were eligible unless they declined, would streamline the process, provide better customer service to voters, and make it easier on election administrators, and it would be a whole lot cheaper for taxpayers.
Registration started as a tool of disenfranchisement. South Carolina in particular started requiring that voters register and re-register in the 1870s and 1880s. The reason it was a tool of disenfranchisement is because African American men in particular, they didn't know when they were born. A lot of streets didn't have names. So all of this information required in order to register to vote was just not available to them. But also the requirement that people re-register, they often had to go to places where there were no registrars, right? So they would just close the office. There was nowhere to re-register. Within a few years, the African American voting population in South Carolina in particular dropped by more than 50%.
In the North, during the same period, late 19th century, there are a lot of different procedural laws passed to try to keep working people from voting, to try to make it more difficult for them to vote. A number of states, including New York, for example, had a requirement of personal annual registration only for people who lived in a larger city. It did not apply statewide. There were specific discriminatory measures passed. One of my favorite also happened to occur in New York State in the early 20th century. The target was the Jewish community, which seemed to have a serious proclivity for voting socialist. And so a registration law was passed that said that there were only 2 days on which you could register to vote in the upcoming elections, and they happened to be the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Other ways to winnow out new communities of voters, African Americans, Hispanics, and immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. You would require literacy tests in order to register, not to vote, but to register to vote. You had to prove you could read English. Or you had to prove what were called understanding tests. You had to prove your ability to understand the state constitution, a clause from the state constitution. This was especially used in the South.
The phrase poll tax does not refer, as we tend to think of, that it's a tax on voting. Poll comes from the Latin meaning head. It was a head tax on a head of household. And in many places, you still had to pay a poll tax in order to vote into the 20th century.
The poll tax was an instrument that was used to suppress both the black vote and to suppress poor whites participating in the political process. And it worked.
Earlier on, there were pauper laws. You couldn't vote if you were on the public dole.
Those laws remain on the books and remain constitutional until the mid-1960s, when a Supreme Court case finally determines that, in the words of the decision, wealth is not germane to the right to vote.
In the South, the effect was much more dramatic than in the North, because the South, it was accompanied by tremendous racial violence. This was the period of the Klan. This was the period of semi-institutionalized lynchings. Violence around the franchise was one of the defining features of Jim Crow.
You had in Alabama something called a Negro hunt, where voters were shot at en masse by terrorists. It wasn't just angry words. There was a great deal of really lethal violence directed at people trying to exercise their right to vote.
The Colfax Massacre is important because it is a symbol of the fact that it was the beginning of the end. We were still in a period of Reconstruction, but African Americans were still not safe, even with federal military presence in the South, because of the fact that white Democrats were committed to the idea of white supremacy and taking back state governments to the point of murder.
The thing to understand is that in the 19th century, when you hear the word Republican, put in your head Democrat. And you hear the word Democrat, put in your head Republican. The parties literally exchanged who they were over the 100 years following the Civil War. Initially, the Republican Party was a somewhat radical party that emphasized inclusion. They wanted emancipation now, and by 1865, they began to call for full basic civil rights for African Americans, including, ultimately, the right to vote. Meanwhile, the Democrats, they were the ones who opposed all these changes. They also organized a campaign of terror, best known under the name Ku Klux Klan, though there were lots of groups that operated during this period, in efforts to exclude people from voting by basically scaring them away from the vote. And the idea was, if we could scare them away from the vote just once, so that we can win the state government, then we could write the laws and we could make it harder and harder for them to vote in the future.
During this period, the Supreme Court was actually pretty committed to reading federal power very narrowly. In a case called U.S. versus Reese, The Supreme Court struck down part of the Enforcement Act of 1871, which would have allowed the federal government to go after individuals who abridged the right to vote of African Americans. But they struck it down on the grounds that it didn't mention abridgment on the basis of race, to track the language of the 15th Amendment. In the presidential election of 1876, Governor Samuel Tilden won the popular vote by 250,000, and he needed one electoral vote in order to secure the presidency. The problem is that there were disputed counts in 3 southern states. In Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, the election boards were still run by Republicans, but that year they had just elected Democratic governors. So there was a change on the horizon in terms of states starting to trend back towards the Democratic Party. And so they cut a deal. A commission was formed, and they agreed that they would give Hayes the presidency if he pulled troops out of the southern states. So the presidential election of 1876 ultimately led to the end of Reconstruction.
What followed was the crackdown on black people, the crackdown on black voting rights, the rise of Jim Crow segregation all throughout the South.
Maybe 10% of black voters in 1880 could still vote in 1900.
The U.S. is one of the most restrictive democracies when it comes to felon rights because of our history with racism.
There are 6 million people in the country that cannot vote by virtue of having a felony conviction. So any reasonable position should be that once you have gotten out of prison, you're back in society, you're paying taxes, you're expected to be a productive citizen, you ought to get your rights to vote back.
It's not one of those things that deters crime. All it does, though, is for those who have done crime and for those who have paid for their crime, it takes away something that actually helps them to feel the dignity of being a citizen.
I think that we believe that people can be redeemed and that people should still have a voice whether or not they made a mistake in their lives. And they should still be able to make decisions that impact their world.
If we want people to engage in pro-social behavior, people who have made mistakes in their past, we need to give them the opportunities and the tools. And voting is about the most pro-social act we have. The great historian Taylor Branch always calls the right to vote a little piece of nonviolence because it's how we resolve our political differences.
The vast majority of states have some sort of system in place where generally you complete your jail time, probation, and parole, and you can vote again. There's 2 states where you can actually vote from prison by absentee ballot. That's Vermont and Maine. And then along with Florida, Iowa and Kentucky have sort of individual mandates where you have to go and plead your case to try to get your voting rights back.
What voting rights at its core is about who gets a seat at the table. And so when you think about felon disenfranchisement, which voice is missing from our conversations about criminal justice reform, about the inequities of what we're spending in terms of education versus prisons, than folks who have actually been through the process.
From the time I got out of prison to the time I got my voting rights was approximately 15 years. The first time I voted, I was so incredibly proud. It was just an amazing feeling to know that I was not the same person that I had been years before when I was convicted. So as I got older, I realized that I needed to be able to vote to make a difference in my community.
Voting is your tool of expression. As you pay your taxes, you live in society. Voting and who's in elected office literally determines the rules of the game. I'm a Broward County School Board member that represents District 5, and we have a very comprehensive program with the Supervisor of Elections where we start registering young people to vote in schools at 16 and 17, and once they become 18, then they are able to actually go out and cast their vote. And as we look at the history of this country, we know that significant change has happened over and over again when young people organized, raised their voices, and matured to voting age and voted and got the changes that we need.
As a convicted felon, I have lost my voting rights, among other rights, and I made a decision that I was not going to allow the time that I was given to break me, to crush me, to just make me another victim of the system. I was going to use that time to develop skills, to develop completely new character, integrity, and all the things that I would need to ultimately leave prison after that 10 years and be able to create the successes that I now have, being out about 9 years now. I think the ability to have my rights restored is like a stamp of approval, if you will. I'm like, hey, the past is the past, and now you've moved on, and I'm not still stuck in paying perpetually for choices I made 25 years ago.
They say you don't appreciate things until you've lost it, you know? And I tell you, when you talk about being able to walk into a voting booth, there's nothing that speaks more to American citizenship. That's that one time when you are on equal footing with everyone. So I have a personal stake in this because of the many stories that I've heard while traveling the state of Florida. Men and women from all political persuasions, all racial backgrounds, who have made mistakes and paid their debt, and years after they have served all their time, they still cannot vote. And just to hear the pain in their voices, you know, and stories of veterans who've put their lives on the line for this country and wrote a bad check and for 30 years not allowed to vote. That's what drives me, and that's what gives me the energy to wake up every day and champion this cause.
In the last decade, you've seen a wave of new laws all across the country designed to make it harder to vote for the first time since the Jim Crow era. And these laws hit harder minorities, young people, poorer people, older people.
Sloppy and ill-designed purge practices can have devastating impacts for eligible citizens. If someone is purged, shows up to vote, in most states, they're going to have a really hard time casting a ballot that will count.
So voter purges are actually not new. They get a lot of attention now because the Supreme Court recently heard a case out of Ohio that dealt with Ohio's attempt to purge its voter rolls and whether or not that attempt was consistent with the National Voter Registration Act. The Supreme Court upheld Ohio's system for purging their voters and cleaning their voter rolls. So it's likely that we'll hear more about voter purges going forward. But in the 2000 election, voter purges actually played a huge role in purging voters from the rolls who were otherwise qualified to turn out. And so it's long been sort of this technique used to disenfranchise individuals whose names are similar to someone who might be deceased, who might have a name that's similar to someone who has a felony conviction and therefore cannot vote. And so these people get caught up when states do these voter purges, and oftentimes they don't find out that they're disenfranchised until they actually go to the polls to try to vote.
This is a remediable problem in that we can demand high standards for what states do and localities do when they're trying to remove people from the rolls. We can give individuals notice before that they are removed. We can demand public notice before we have large-scale removals, and we can just make sure that the processes are happening under the timeframes and under the protections that Congress set out.
The people who we vote into office, we need to make sure that when we vote them in, we know who we're voting for, why we're voting for them, and what we expect out of them. So that if they don't fulfill their promises, we can kick them out next election cycle.
If voters aren't educated and don't prioritize the issues over the person, then we'll elect people who shouldn't be in office, and that'll further perpetuate the issues that we have and bring about more problems.
We do have a voice, and we do have power, and we do have ways to make people accountable.
Citizen University is a national nonprofit that's based in Seattle, Washington. And we do work all over the country to build civic power and cultivate civic character. And the Joy of Voting project is about how we create a sense of joy, a sense of ritual, a sense of community around voting. So for the Joy of Voting project, for each city that we go to, we start out by listening, by holding a brainstorm session with local organizers, designers, artists, everyday citizens to ask, what does the culture of voting look like in your city? What would it look like if it were joyful? And then there's an open submission period where everyone can submit ideas, and then we select 5 in each city to give a little bit of money to make this thing happen. And it could be parties and festivals and celebrations at the polls. It could be art projects, new posters or stickers designed by local artists about voting. It could be performances. We've had plays and art installations and concerts. All of these creative ways that are specific to that community, specific to that place.
Some of the ideas that are interesting are dance challenges, events at schools.
Definitely voter pub crawl and voter run. Also flying trapeze, a radical voters garden with some kinetic sculpture involved.
The way I want to get people to vote is through performing arts.
We wanted to have a festival. So we're going to go ahead and have a red carpet.
The Joy of Voting, they want to reinvigorate the unity and the enthusiasm around voting, which is what gives the people the power.
Why is Election Day held on a Tuesday? Why do you have to register at all? When it comes to who is going to represent us on the city council, in the mayor's office, in the governor's mansion, in the White House, in Congress, the answer to who decides is who shows up. And so if more people show up to vote, then the answer to who decides is more of us.
There was a precursor to the Voting Rights Act. It was called the Federal Elections Bill of 1890. It was designed to do many of the same things that the Voting Rights Act eventually did.
It would have applied nationwide, and it would have provided federal oversight of elections from registration to casting a ballot. It would have had the effect of addressing fraud in voting. It would have had the effect of also addressing the disenfranchisement of African Americans, because it would have limited the discretion that Southern registrars had to disenfranchise that population.
And it failed very, very narrowly in Congress. Really, a few votes on a filibuster would have made the difference.
So the Federal Elections Bill, also known as the Lodge Force Act, probably would have resulted in more people voting. So we wouldn't have needed a 1965 Voting Rights Act.
When I was growing up, I saw the need for change. And the action of Rosa Parks and the words and leadership of Dr. King inspired me to try to do something about it. So through the Civil Rights Movement and later the whole push for the right to vote became part of my involvement. I happen to believe that the right to vote is precious. It's almost sacred in a democratic society such as ours. It is the most powerful, non-violent instrument or tool that we have. And everybody, every single person who's a citizen, who's of age, should be able to cast that vote. It should be as simple, as easy as getting a glass of water. And there must not be anything to prohibit or infringe on that right. During the 60s, my mother, my father, my grandparents, and so many of my teachers couldn't register to vote simply because of the color of their skin. There were people told they could not read or write well enough, that to pass a so-called literacy test, interpret certain section of the Constitution of the state of Alabama, or count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. So we organized, we mobilized. We did what I call getting in the way. During the summer of 1964, we organized the Mississippi Summer Project for more than 1,000 young people, students, religious leaders, lawyers and doctors and teachers came south. And I will never forget, on the summer night of June 21st, 1964, 3 young men that I knew, Andy Goodman and Mickey Scherner from New York, and James Shaney from the state of Mississippi, went out to investigate the burning of an African-American church to be used for voter registration workshop. These 3 young men were detained by the sheriff, arrested, and later that evening they were taken from the jail and turned over to the Klan, where they were beaten, shot, and killed. It was a sad and dark time for the movement, but we didn't give up. We kept the faith. We kept our eyes on the prize. We kept working, and we kept pushing. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, about 600 of us attempted to walk or march from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation and to the world that people wanted to register to vote, to become participants in the democratic process. We had a right to march, the right to protest. The right to assembly is guaranteed and protected by the Constitution. But on that day, we were beaten, we were trampled by horses, we were tear gassed. I was hit in the head by a state trooper, had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. But somehow, in some way, people responded to the fact that these American citizens were so determined, that the President of the United States responded, the Congress responded, and President Lyndon Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act. Congress debated it, it passed, and was signed into law on August 6, 1965. Only thing I did, I gave a little blood on that bridge. But others throughout the South gave their very lives. The Voting Rights Act was the most successful civil rights law probably in American history. It ended discrimination in voting. It enabled African Americans, people who didn't speak English so well, all kinds of racial minorities, to be able to actually exercise the franchise.
We often think about the Voting Rights Act in connection with African American suffrage, but it was also very important for women because it helped to manifest the promise and the ideals of these earlier amendments, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, and the 19th.
The reason for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the difficulty of enforcing the rules already in place prohibiting bias in running elections. What it said is for those districts that were the most egregious at excluding people from the vote, essentially where you had under 50% voter registration of people based on race, as of the end of 1964.
The most important provisions of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 prohibited any abridgment or denial of the right to vote on the basis of race, and it applied nationwide. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act applied to most states in the Deep South and some other jurisdictions, and basically it required those jurisdictions to pre-clear any changes to their election laws.
If you want to change your voting regulations, rules, times, machines, anything, you had to go to the government first, the Justice Department or a 3-judge court of the District Court of District of Columbia, and simply say, here's our plan. And they then had 90 days to look at it and say, one thing, would this make it harder for minorities to vote? If the answer was yes, it would make it harder, they would deny it. If they wouldn't make it harder, didn't have to make it easier, but if it didn't make it harder, they would allow it to go through.
The Voting Rights Act, Section 5 in particular, has been reauthorized several times. And the interesting thing is that every time that it's reauthorized, it's challenged as unconstitutional. So Shelby County is in Alabama, and that is a state that has had a terrible record on voting rights. So Shelby County versus Holder became a case because the government under Eric Holder refused to pre-clear a change that they wanted to make to their law, and they challenged the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act.
In the Shelby County case in 2013, the Supreme Court effectively gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
This was a provision of the Voting Rights Act that has been credited for much of the social gains that we've had in this country and has been attributed to much of the opening up of the electoral process that we've seen, and has also been upheld by numerous Supreme Courts before it.
In the 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court found that the coverage formula of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because it had the effect of discriminating between the states in what the Chief Justice termed the equal sovereignty principle. So it treated states in the South worse than it treated northern states that had committed similar voting rights violations, but were not subject to the preclearance requirement. So he said that was a violation of our Constitution's principle of equal sovereignty. So equal sovereignty has typically referred to the conditions upon which states are admitted to the Union. We have not viewed it as a principle that applies for the duration of the life of a state. So the Chief Justice, I think, applied the equal sovereignty principle in a very novel way.
This Supreme Court decided that the particular provision that said where Section 5 had to operate, it's also called the Section 4, was outdated. And that because it was outdated, Section 5 couldn't operate anywhere, which was a tremendous blow. being dealt to the effectiveness of the Voting Rights Act, and also means that parts of the country that had enjoyed federal protection against race discrimination lost some of the strongest federal protections that they had.
Section 5 had largely succeeded in its fundamental purposes, so it became less and less important over time. Now that you had black political power, it became harder and harder to say that the only way that blacks could exercise political power is if they were protected by the federal government.
After the Shelby County decision came down, we saw Texas try to immediately begin operating the most restrictive photo ID law in the country. We saw politicians in North Carolina say publicly that now that there's not Section 5, they're going to add more to a bill that would have made it harder for people to vote. Places that had had restrictive policies in abeyance because they knew that they wouldn't pass Section 5 muster suddenly opened the floodgates.
There's no question that states felt liberated by this, but I don't know that it made that much difference politically. And I don't know that Section 5 did anything but say that Texas would have done that anyway and would have litigated it in D.C. District Court. Instead, they litigated it in Texas District Court. They would have had, hopefully, an unwelcome reception in D.C. District Court. They certainly got an unwelcome reception in Texas District Court.
When the Supreme Court made a decision gutting the Voting Rights Act of 1965, I wanted to cry. I would love to take members of the United States Supreme Court back to Selma and walk across that bridge.
I really believe that voting is the key to addressing every one of our social, economic problems that we face as a people.
The more people who participate, the better it is for democracy.
We are not a democracy for the most of us, we are a democracy for all of us.
I think most politicians worry about are whether or not they're going to be reelected. And by getting out there and voting, you make that determination.
I think young people can make such a big difference, and so many of us have strong opinions, and we go out and we protest, so much of us, but so few of us make the decision to go out there and vote. But the moment that we make that decision to step into a voting booth, that's when we can really change our elected officials, and that's when we can really get the policies that we want in place.
We're still trying to figure out all of the fallout from having a court that does not think that the Voting Rights Act is needed, a court that does not think partisan gerrymandering is a threat to our democracy. We are still trying to figure out what that means for the future of the right to vote, and it's a conversation that we'll be having for decades to come.
You cannot ask them to hear you if you are not talking. Go vote, go out there, make sure that what you're saying is being heard. There's no reason not to.
There's no such thing as not voting. Not voting is voting. It's voting to turn your power over to somebody who might have a completely opposed view of what should happen.
Your power is you decide who decides.